The sun beat down on the cracked earth of Redemption Creek, bleaching the landscape to bone white. Heat shimmered above the red sand like a phantom river, making the distant mesas tremble. It was a town that lived up to its name, only in the driest, most ironic sense. A place where souls came not for salvation, but to outrun their past until the desert swallowed them whole. Rhett Mallory was just passing through. He guided his wagon down the dusty main street of the clapboard storefronts, looking tired and thirsty under the oppressive midday glare. All he needed was flour salt and maybe a length of rope. Then he could retreat to the quiet solitude of his ranch, to the familiar rhythm of chores and the laughter of his children, the only life he wanted anymore. He tied the horse to the hitching post outside the general store, the leather creaking in protest. The air was thick with the smells of dust horse and the faint sweet scent of baking bread from the saloon down the way. An unnatural quiet had fallen over the street, the kind that precedes a storm or a gunshot. Rhett felt it in his bones, a low hum of wrongness that made the hairs on his arms stand up. He'd learned long ago to trust that feeling. It happened in a heartbeat. The doors of the Redemption Bank burst open, splintering wood against the frame. 4 masked riders stormed out, burlap sacks slung over their shoulders. One of them fired a pistol into the sky, a sharp crack that shattered the midday calm. Pandemonium erupted. A woman screamed. Horses reared their whinnies, shrill with panic. Townsfolk dove for cover behind water troughs and overturned barrels. Rhett instinctively dropped behind his wagon, his hand hovering over the worn handle of the Colt Peacemaker, holstered at his hip. He was a rancher, now a father. Not the man he used to be. But instinct was a stubborn thing. The robbers scrambled for their horses. "Go, go!" One of them yelled, his voice muffled by the bandana over his face. They swung into their saddles, kicking up clouds of red dust. From the second-story window of the sheriff's office, a rifle shot rang out, a deeper, more deliberate sound. One of the riders cried out a strangled gasp and pitched sideways from his horse. He hit the ground with a heavy final thud, a dark stain spreading across the back of his shirt. His horse spooked and riderless galloped away down the street. The other 3 didn't stop. They spurred their mounts, firing blindly behind them as they fled town, leaving their fallen comrade to die in the dust. The street fell silent again, the only sounds the frantic panting of a stray dog and the slow creak of the saloon sign swinging in the hot wind. Sheriff Coulter, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard years, emerged from his office rifle, still smoking. He limped toward the body, his expression grim. Rhett stayed where he was, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He had seen death before, too much of it. He had no desire to see it again. But as his gaze fell upon the dead outlaw, something caught the light. A glint of silver near the man's outstretched hand. Something had fallen from his pocket when he hit the ground. Curiosity, cold and unwelcome, pulled Rhett from behind the wagon. He walked slowly toward the body, his boots scuffing in the thick dust. Sheriff Coulter glanced up, giving him a curt nod of recognition. "Mallory. Fancy seeing you in the middle of a gunfight. Just came for supplies." Rhett said, his voice a low rumble. His eyes were fixed on the object in the dirt. It was a silver locket, oval-shaped and tarnished with age. An intricate design of swirling vines was etched into its surface. A cold dread, sharp and suffocating, coiled in Rhett's gut. His breath caught like a snagged thread. He knew that design. He had traced it with his thumb 1,000 times. He knelt, his movement stiff, and reached out a trembling hand. He picked up the locket. It was warm from the sun. With a flick of his thumb, he opened it. Inside, nestled on one side, was a tiny faded portrait of himself, younger and clean-shaven. On the other side was a portrait of a woman with kind eyes and a smile that could gentle a storm. His wife, Sarah. The world tilted. The sounds of the street faded to a distant roar. This locket, this specific one-of-a-kind locket he had commissioned for her on their first anniversary, was supposed to be buried with her. It had been clasped around her neck in the pine box he had built with his own hands 4 years ago. "What is it?" Sheriff Coulter asked, his voice cutting through the fog in Rhett's mind. Rhett couldn't speak. He just stared at the impossible object in his palm. How did a dead bank robber end up with his dead wife's locket? The question was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. The quiet life he had so carefully constructed, the fragile peace he had built on a foundation of grief and forgetting, shattered into a million pieces. The past he thought was buried had just been dug up and thrown at his feet. He closed his fingers around the locket, the metal biting into his skin. The trip for flour and salt was over. A different journey, one back into the shadows he had fought so hard to escape, had just begun. The ride back to the ranch was a long, silent torment. The familiar landscape, the vast, unforgiving expanse of scrub and rock under an endless blue sky, offered no comfort. Every creak of the wagon wheels, every jingle of the harness, seemed to mock him, whispering questions he couldn't answer. He held the locket tight in his fist, the edges digging into his palm, a painful physical anchor to a mystery that felt like a phantom clawing at his throat. Who was that man? A common thief or something more? Had someone desecrated Sarah's grave? The thought was a vile poison spreading through him, turning his grief into a cold, hard rage. He topped the final rise and saw his homestead nestled in the shallow valley below. The sight that usually filled him with a quiet sense of peace now only tightened the knot in his chest. A modest cabin, sturdy and weathered with smoke curling from its stone chimney. A barn patched with care, not money. A chicken coop and a small fenced-in garden where green shoots were just beginning to push through the dark soil. It was a world he had built for them, for his children. A fortress against the very darkness that now rode with him in the wagon. As he pulled up to the cabin, the door flew open. A whirlwind of blonde hair and boundless energy launched itself from the porch. Papa 6-year-old Cal ran to the wagon, his small face alight with joy. "Did you bring me a peppermint stick?" Rhett forced a smile, the muscles in his face feeling stiff and foreign. "Maybe next time, son." He swung down from the seat, and Cal immediately wrapped his arms around his leg. Behind him, 13-year-old Jude appeared in the doorway, his expression cautious and mature, beyond his years. He held a half-carved piece of wood in his hand, his movements already showing the same deliberate care as his father's. Miriam, 10, with her mother's soft eyes and a spray of freckles across her nose, peeked out from behind her brother. "Is everything all right?" Papa Jude asked, his eyes scanning Rhett's face, already sensing the shift in the air. "Everything's fine." Rhett lied, his voice rough. He ruffled Cal's hair and gave Miriam a nod. He couldn't let them see the storm raging inside him. This was their sanctuary. He would not let his ghosts haunt their home. That night, after the children were asleep, Rhett sat by the hearth, the fire casting flickering shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The house was quiet, save for the crackle of the flames and the sigh of the wind outside. He opened his hand and stared at the locket again. He saw Sarah's smile and the pain of her loss, a wound he thought had scarred over, felt as fresh as the day he'd lost her. He had told the children she'd been taken by a fever. It was a kinder truth than the real one. The real truth involved a foolish duel over a land dispute, a man named Thomas Larkin, and a single stray bullet. A bullet from his own gun. He had won the duel, but the shot that killed Larkin had passed through him and struck Sarah, who had run out at the last second, trying to stop the madness. He had held her as her life bled out into the dust, her last breath a whispered apology. He lived with that memory every day, a private hell of his own making. He'd left that life behind, sold the disputed land, and moved his family here to start over, to be the man she would have wanted him to be. A father, a rancher, nothing more. But this locket, it was a message from that buried life, a desecration, a threat. He didn't know which, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. Days turned into a week. Rhett tried to slip back into the familiar rhythm of ranch life, mending fences, clearing brush, tending to the livestock. But the locket sat in his pocket like a stone, a constant, heavy reminder. His nights were plagued by nightmares, the crack of a pistol, Sarah's shocked face, the accusing eyes of Thomas Larkin. He grew quieter, his words becoming even more sparse, his smiles more fleeting. The children noticed. They moved around him with a gentle caution, their usual boisterous energy subdued, as if they were afraid of breaking something fragile. It was during a particularly harsh dust storm a week later that she appeared. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, whipping sand against the cabin windows, visibility reduced to a few feet of swirling brown haze. Rhett was securing the barn door when he saw her, a figure stumbling out of the dust-choked twilight, little more than a ghost. She was thin, her dress a tattered rag that hung loosely on her skeletal frame. Her bare feet were bruised and cut. She fell to her knees, not 10 yards from the porch, her body finally giving out. Rhett ran to her, his own troubles momentarily forgotten. He knelt and gently turned her over. She was a girl, maybe 16 or 17, her face sunken and pale beneath a layer of grime. Her eyes fluttered open wide with a terror so profound it seemed to have been etched into her very soul. He saw bruises on her arms, angry and purple, and a fresh cut on her cheek. I'm sorry, she whispered, her lips cracked and bleeding. Didn't mean to bother you. He looked her over, not with judgment, but with a deep, aching recognition. He saw the way her collarbone jutted out like it might split her skin. He knew what it was to run from something worse than a storm. You hungry? He asked, his voice softer than he intended. She blinked, stunned by the simple question, then gave a slow, hesitant nod. He lifted her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing. Come on then, he said, carrying her toward the light of the cabin. I got stew. Her name was June. She didn't offer it, he had to ask. She ate slowly, at first ashamed of the desperate way her hands trembled as she reached for the food. Then, as the warmth of the stew spread through her, she began to cry. Silent tears fell into the broth, each one a testament to an ocean of unspoken pain. Rhett didn't say a word about them. He just let her cry, refilling her bowl when it was empty. The children watched from the doorway, their curiosity warring with their caution. Cal, ever the bold one, crept closer. Are you going to live here now? He asked, his mouth full of an apple slice. Cal, Rhett warned gently. June shook her head, wiping her face with the back of her hand. No, I just needed to sit. I'll go. No one's chasing you out. Rhett said plainly, his gaze steady. Not if you're running from worse. Her breath hitched. He saw her then. Not just the bruises, not just the hunger. Her. A person cornered by the world. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, a fragile sanctuary was forming. Rhett gave her an old dress of Miriam's and told her she could wash up in the basin by the fire. When she emerged, her skin scrubbed clean and her damp hair combed back, the transformation was startling. The fear was still in her eyes, but a spark of something else, something like hope, flickered there as well. I should go, she whispered as the storm began to subside. Where to, Rhett asked. She had no answer. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. He folded his arms, his expression unreadable. Well, you can stay here tonight. We've got blankets and space on the bench. Door locks from the inside. That last part mattered more than he knew. A flicker of gratitude crossed her face. She nodded, unable to speak. That night, her nightmares came sharp and violent. She screamed, once a raw, terrified sound that jolted her upright, her hands pressed to her mouth. Rhett rose from his cot, not to comfort her with touch or words, but to add another log to the fire. He sat by the flames, a silent, steady presence in the dark, and waited. After a long while, June left the bench and sat on the floor near him. The firelight danced on her face, illuminating the haunted look in her eyes. "I'm not good at anything," she whispered to the flames. "Everything I do is wrong." Rhett stared into the fire. "My wife used to burn biscuits so bad we'd have to use them as doorstops." A small, watery laugh escaped her. It was a fragile sound, like the chime of broken glass. "You're not wrong," Rhett said, turning his gaze to her. "You've just been told that so many times you started believing it." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the quiet room. "A person needs a place. This is one." He saw the same desperate need for sanctuary in her eyes that he felt in his own soul. He was trying to build a safe harbor for his children, but maybe, just maybe, it was big enough for one more lost soul. "I've got work," he continued. "Chores, room, and my kids. Well, they've been needing a sister more than I knew." Her eyes welled up again. He didn't push. He stood, tossed a thick wool blanket over her shoulders, and left her with the warmth of the fire. As he settled back onto his cot, his fingers brushed against the locket in his pocket. Two broken pasts had just collided under his roof. He had no idea if they could heal each other or if they would simply shatter one another completely. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of rain and damp earth. June awoke to the sounds of a life she'd only ever dreamed of, the gentle clucking of chickens, the rhythmic splitting of kindling, and the soft hum of Miriam brushing her hair. The house smelled of oats and cedar, a scent so far removed from the rot and bitterness of her stepmother's home that it felt like she'd woken up in a different world. She found Rhett outside, mending a section of the fence line that bordered the northern slope. The dawn was pale, and frost still clung to the grass in brittle whispers. He didn't look up as she approached, just kept hammering the rail, his movements slow and measured. "You sleep any?" he asked, his voice a low rumble in the crisp morning air. "Some," she answered, hugging the blanket he'd given her tighter. "I can help." He stopped hammering and looked at her, his eyes assessing. "You know fence lines." "No, but I learned quick." He rubbed his jaw, then motioned to the shed. "There's gloves in there and boots. Find a pair that fits. Can't have you getting splinters on your second day." Second day. He said it like it was a fact, not a question. A warmth spread through June's chest, chasing away some of the deep-seated chill. As she turned toward the shed, she caught the faintest flicker of a smile behind his beard. It wasn't much, but to June it felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. June learned to twist wire taut to milk the cow without getting kicked, and to tell by the set of Jude's shoulders whether he needed help or solitude. She worked alongside Rhett, their silence, companionable, filled with the sounds of shared labor. The honest exhaustion she felt at the end of each day was a balm to her soul. It wasn't the kind beaten into her by cruelty, but the kind earned through purpose. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, painting the fields in gold and rust, June sat on the porch with Miriam peeling potatoes. "Papa makes the best apple pie this side of Dry Creek." Miriam set her legs swinging. "He burns the edges sometimes, but the middle's always soft and sweet. I'd like to try it sometime." June said, a genuine smile reaching her eyes for the first time. "You will," Miriam replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You're part of the house now. You sit at our table. That's all that matters." The simple declaration struck June with the force of a revelation. She had been so focused on being useful, on earning her keep, that she hadn't realized she was simply being accepted. But peace on the frontier was a fragile thing. 2 weeks after June's arrival, word came from town. A circuit pastor making his rounds stopped at the ranch for water. He spoke of a barn fire down at Morrow's Hollow and mentioned a woman named Clara Wren, who was making loud inquiries about a runaway girl spinning tales of theft and ingratitude. "You seen anyone fitting that description?" the pastor asked, his voice carefully neutral. Rhett, his face an unreadable mask, took his time answering. "Seen a lot of folks lately," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Winter pushes people around, makes them desperate. After the pastor rode off, Rhett found June sweeping the hearth. "We might get visitors," he said, his tone grim. "Folks asking questions." June froze, the broom clutched in her hands. "Should I leave?" Rhett's brow furrowed. "You scared?" She nodded, her throat tight with fear. "Well," he said, his voice like solid rock, "that's enough reason to stay." Clara Wren didn't send a pastor the next time. She came herself. She arrived in a rickety wagon, dressed in her funereal black, a deputy with a bored expression sitting beside her. June's blood ran cold at the sight of her. She dropped the laundry basket she was carrying and ran inside. "She can't take me," June gasped, her voice trembling. "She can't." Rhett was already at the door, his large frame filling the entrance. He stepped out onto the porch as Clara's wagon creaked to a halt. "This your land, Mallory?" Clara asked, her voice dripping with venom. "It is," Rhett replied calmly. "You got something of mine?" "I don't think I do." Clara's eyes narrowed to slits. "That girl June? She's a ward of my household. She ran off." "She's a person," Rhett said, his voice dropping an octave. "And she's here because she wants to be." The deputy, looking weary of the whole affair, cleared his throat. "You got proof of guardianship, ma'am, papers?" Clara stiffened. "She was left in my care by her dying father." "But no papers," the deputy pressed. Rhett crossed his arms, his presence imposing. "She's also got bruises that say more than papers do." Clara's face mottled with rage. "She's a liar, a little snake with no gratitude." At that moment, June stepped out from behind Rhett. She was trembling, but she didn't cower. She stood beside him, her small frame radiating a newfound strength. "She starved me," June said, her voice clear and steady. "She beat me and locked me out in the cold. Now that I'm not there to clean her floorboards, she wants me back." The deputy sighed, looking from Clara's furious face to June's determined one. "This ain't a court, ma'am, but I ain't dragging a girl anywhere against her will. She wants to stay, she stays." Clara's face turned from red to a ghastly white. "You'll regret this," she hissed at Rhett, her eyes burning with hatred. "All of you will." She wheeled the wagon around with a vicious crack of the reins, kicking up dust like a curse. As they watched her disappear over the hill, Rhett turned to June. He saw the terror still lingering in her eyes, but also a flicker of victory. The confrontation with Clara, however, was like throwing a stone into a still pond. The ripples spread further than they could have imagined. News of the incident reached Redemption Creek, and from there the county seat. It reached the ears of a man who took a particular interest in matters of justice and order. A man who saw the law not as a shield for the innocent, but as a weapon to be wielded. Judge Alistair Larkin sat in his polished oak office, the afternoon sun slanting through the tall window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. He was a man of cold, eloquent precision, his face thin and severe, his eyes the color of a winter sky. He listened impassively as his clerk recounted the story of the runaway girl and the stubborn rancher who had harbored her. Mallory Larkin repeated the name, tasting like ash in his mouth. Rhett Mallory. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the town below. The name echoed in the chambers of his memory, stirring a cold, dormant hatred. He remembered that name from a coroner's report years ago. A report that had ruled his brother Thomas's death the result of a duel of honor. Larkin had never believed it. He saw it for what it was, murder. And now the man who had taken his brother and destroyed his family was building a new one of his own. A cruel, calculating smile touched Larkin's thin lips. "It seems Mr. Mallory has a penchant for taking things that don't belong to him," he said softly to the empty room. "First, my brother's life, now this girl." He turned back to his desk. "Find me a man named S. Everett Kane, and draft a formal inquiry into the guardianship of one June Wren. We will see how Mr. Mallory fares when he faces a power greater than his fists. We will use the law to dismantle his life piece by piece." Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Rhett felt a different kind of disquiet. That night, he had another nightmare. He was back on that dusty patch of land, the sun hot on his neck. He saw Thomas Larkin's face contorted with rage. He heard the deafening crack of the pistols firing simultaneously. He saw Sarah running toward them, her mouth open in a silent scream. And he saw her locket swinging from her neck before she fell. He woke up in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs. The past was not just resurfacing. It was hunting him. And it was wearing a judge's robe. The weeks following Clara's visit were a tense, fragile peace. June flourished under the open sky, the color returning to her cheeks, her laughter becoming a frequent sound that mingled with the children's. She and Rhett fell into a partnership, born of shared work and unspoken understanding. He taught her how to read the clouds for rain and how to mend a harness with waxed thread. She, in turn, brought a softness back into the house, her quiet presence a balm on the family's old wounds. But the shadow of Judge Larkin was long. It began with whispers in town. When Rhett went for supplies, he was met with cold shoulders and suspicious glances. Rumors seeded by Larkin's agents had begun to circulate that Rhett Mallory was an unstable man, a recluse with a violent past who had taken in a troubled girl for his own questionable purposes. The story of June's abuse was twisted into a tale of a manipulative runaway who had preyed on a lonely widower. Rhett ignored the whispers, his face a mask of stone. But June saw the toll it took. She saw the way his jaw tightened when he returned from town, the way he lingered on the porch at night, scanning the dark horizon. The sanctuary he had built was being besieged, not by fists and guns, but by words which were often sharper and more insidious. One crisp autumn afternoon, a lone rider approached the ranch. He was not a neighbor or a traveling preacher. He was dressed in a clean black coat and polished boots, his demeanor radiating an unnerving stillness. He dismounted at the gate and did not approach the house, simply waited, a silent, imposing figure. Rhett came out onto the porch, June watching from the window, her heart pounding. "Can I help you?" Rhett called out, his voice wary. The man tipped his hat. "S. Everett Kane," he said, his voice smooth and devoid of warmth. "I'm here on behalf of Judge Alistair Larkin." Rhett's posture stiffened. The name Larkin landed like a punch. The judge has taken an interest in the welfare of the minor. June Wren Kane continued, his eyes flicking toward the cabin. He has authorized a formal inquiry into her living situation. Consider this a preliminary visit. "She's fine where she is," Rhett said, his voice low and dangerous. Kane offered a thin reptilian smile. "The law will be the judge of that, Mr. Mallory. Not you." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "I've heard stories about you. About what happened to your wife. Tragedies have a way of following some men. It would be a shame for another one to unfold here." The veiled reference to Sarah was a deliberate, cruel jab. Rhett's hand clenched into a fist at his side. He wanted to cross the yard and wipe the smirk off Kane's face, but he knew that was exactly what Larkin wanted. An outburst. Proof of his instability. "You've said your piece," Rhett said through gritted teeth. "Now get off my land." Kane's smile widened. "Of course. We'll be in touch." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a trail of cold dread in his wake. That night, Rhett finally told June about the locket. He pulled it from his pocket and laid it on the table between them, the silver catching the lamplight. "This was my wife's," he said, his voice heavy. "It was buried with her. I found it on a dead bank robber in Redemption Creek a few weeks ago." June stared at it, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "But how?" "I don't know," Rhett admitted, the words tearing at him. "But it feels connected. This Judge Larkin, his interest in you. It's not about justice, June. It's about me." He finally voiced the fear that had been festering inside him. This was a vendetta. He had a nightmare again that night, more vivid than before. He saw the duel, but this time he saw Larkin's face clearly. and standing behind him, watching from the shadows, was a younger, thinner man with the same cold, winter sky eyes. Alistair Larkin. He had been there. He had watched his brother die. The legal pressure mounted. A formal summons arrived, delivered by a grim-faced deputy ordering Rhett to appear before Judge Larkin's court to determine June's legal guardianship. It was a trap, and they both knew it. Larkin wouldn't be seeking truth. He would be manufacturing a verdict. Rhett rode to see Sheriff Coulter laying out his suspicions, showing him the summons. The old sheriff listened, chewing on his unlit pipe. Larkin's a powerful man. Rhett Coulter said, his voice heavy with resignation. He's got friends in high places, and he knows how to twist the law into any shape he likes. I've heard the whispers about his brother. He's never let that go. So you're saying there's nothing you can do? Rhett asked, his frustration boiling over. I'm saying a courtroom presided over by that man is no place to look for justice, Coulter said. He's not trying to win a case. He's trying to break you. Taking that girl away is just the first step. Rhett returned to the ranch defeated. The law, the very thing meant to protect them, was being turned into a weapon against them. He found June in the garden, her hands in the dirt, a determined look on her face. We're not going, are we? She asked, not looking up from her work. He'll just send men to take you by force, Rhett said. Then what do we do? She asked, her voice quiet but firm. Rhett looked at his home, at the life he had built, at the young woman who had become as much a part of it as his own children. He thought of the locket, a symbol of a past desecrated. He thought of Larkin's cold eyes, filled with a hatred that had festered for years. Running was not an option. This was his land, his family. This was where he would make his stand. But he wouldn't do it in Larkin's courtroom. He knew Larkin would not be satisfied with a slow legal victory. A man consumed by that kind of vengeance was not a patient man. He would grow tired of the pretense and resort to more direct methods. He would send Cain. We prepare, Rhett said, his voice hard as iron. He wants a fight, we'll give him one. But it will be on our terms, on our ground. He spent the next few days fortifying the ranch. He boarded up the smaller windows, checked his rifle and ammunition, and showed Jude how to reload the spare pistol. He paced the property like a caged animal, his senses on high alert, waiting for the inevitable. The idyllic peace of the ranch was gone, replaced by the tense, heavy atmosphere of a fortress under siege. June did not shrink from the preparations. She stockpiled water and food. She learned how to clean the rifle, her small hands moving with a steady, determined grace. She was no longer the frightened girl who had stumbled out of the dust storm. She was a soldier, defending her home. The attack came not at night, as they had expected, but in the brazen light of late afternoon. Rhett was on the roof, scanning the horizon, when he saw the dust cloud. 4 riders moving fast. He scrambled down the ladder. They're here, he yelled. June, get the children to the root cellar. June herded a frightened Miriam and Cal toward the heavy cellar door in the floor of the cabin, while Jude stood by the back window, pistol in hand, his young face pale but set with determination. Rhett took his position by the front door, his rifle resting on the window frame. The riders reined in just outside the fence line. It was Cain and 3 other hard-faced men. Mallory Cain shouted, "The time for games is over. Judge Larkin has issued a warrant for your arrest, obstruction of justice, and we're taking the girl." "The only thing you'll be taking from this land is a bellyful of lead," Rhett shouted back. Cain laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "You and what army?" He gave a signal, and his men spread out, dismounting and taking cover behind rocks and the water trough. The first shot came from one of Cain's men, splintering the wood next to Rhett's head. The siege had begun. The air exploded with the roar of gunfire. Rhett returned fire, the kick of the rifle, a familiar grim comfort against his shoulder. He aimed not to kill, but to pin them down, to make them understand that this ground would be paid for in blood. A bullet whizzed past his ear, thudding into the log wall behind him. Splinters rained down on the floor. From the back of the cabin, Jude fired the pistol. The shot was wild, but it made one of Kane's men duck for cover, giving Rhett a precious second to reload. "Stay down." Jude Rhett yelled, his heart pounding with a fierce protective terror. The exchange of fire continued for what felt like an eternity. The sun beat down, the smell of gunpowder, thick and acrid in the air. Kane and his men were patient, content to wear him down, to wait for a mistake. They had the numbers and the time. Rhett knew he couldn't hold them off forever. Then a new sound cut through the chaos, the terrified neigh of a horse, followed by the crackle of flames. "Fire!" Jude yelled from the back window. "They've set the barn on fire." Black smoke began to billow from the barn, thick and choking. Rhett's stomach clenched. His horses, his tools, the winter feed, everything was in there. It was a cruel, calculated move designed to draw him out. "They're trying to flush us out," Papa Jude cried. Rhett's mind raced. He was trapped. If he stayed, the fire might spread to the cabin. If he went out, he'd be shot down in the open. "June," he yelled, his voice raw, "is the cellar secure?" "Yes," her voice came back faint but steady from beneath the floorboards. "We're safe." Kane's voice cut through the noise again. "Give up, Mallory. It's over. Give us the girl and we'll let you put out your fire." Rhett looked at the burning barn, the culmination of years of hard work turning to ash. He looked back into the dark interior of his home where his family was hiding. The choice was no choice at all. Suddenly, from the root cellar, June's voice called out stronger this time. "There's another way out, the old ventilation shaft. It comes out behind the woodpile." Hope, sharp and startling, shot through Rhett. It was a narrow, dirt-packed tunnel, barely big enough for Cal to crawl through, dug years ago to prevent moisture buildup. He had forgotten all about it. "Can you all fit?" he yelled. "We have to," she replied. "You create a distraction. We'll make a run for the creek bed." It was a desperate, foolish plan. But it was the only one they had. "All right," Rhett shouted back. "On my signal, go." He took a deep breath, picturing the layout of the yard in his mind. He knew every rock, every dip in the terrain. He stood up away from the window and fired 2 quick shots through the cabin wall toward the water trough. Then he kicked open the front door and laid down a barrage of covering fire, moving from one side of the doorway to the other, making it seem like there were 2 shooters inside. The ruse worked. Kane and his men focused their attention on the front of the cabin, their bullets thudding into the log walls. Under the cover of the noise and confusion, June pushed the children through the narrow tunnel. Cal went first, then Miriam with June, right behind them. Rhett saw a flash of movement near the woodpile at the back of the house. He saw them, small figures scrambling low to the ground, disappearing into the tall grass that led down to the creek. They were out. A wave of relief washed over him, so potent it almost buckled his knees. Now it was his turn. He fired his last 2 rounds, threw the rifle down, and drew his Colt. He burst out the back door, running in a low crouch toward the creek, zigzagging as he went. A bullet tore through the sleeve of his shirt. Another kicked up dirt by his feet. He dove behind a rocky outcropping just as his world exploded in pain. A searing heat shot through his left leg. He cried out, stumbling, and fell hard behind the rocks. He looked down. Blood was soaking through his trousers, a dark, spreading stain. He had been hit. He could hear Kane's men shouting, moving to flank him. He was pinned down, wounded, and running out of time. He gritted his teeth against the pain, reloading his pistol with shaking hands. This was it. This was where he would die, defending a patch of dirt and a lifetime of regret. He thought of Sarah. He thought of his children. He thought of June's face, her eyes filled with a strength she didn't know she had. He would not die cowering behind a rock. He pushed himself up, ready to make his final stand, when he heard a new sound and the thunder of approaching hooves, and a voice bellowing like the wrath of God. "Drop your weapons. This is the sheriff's department." Sheriff Coulter and 3 deputies crested the hill, their rifles leveled. Kane and his men, caught completely by surprise, froze. One of them made the mistake of raising his pistol toward the lawmen. A shot from Coulter's rifle sent him spinning to the ground. Kane, seeing the tables had turned, threw his hands in the air. "There's been a misunderstanding, Sheriff," he yelled. "The only misunderstanding," Coulter growled, dismounting and limping toward him, "is you thinking you could get away with this." Rhett collapsed back against the rock, his strength finally giving out. He saw June and the children emerge from the creek bed, and their faces streaked with dirt and tears. June ran to him, her eyes wide with terror as she saw the blood. "Rhett," she cried, dropping to her knees beside him. He managed a weak grin. Just a scratch, he lied, his vision starting to blur at the edges. As Coulter's men rounded up Kane and his thugs, the old sheriff knelt beside Rhett. He looked at the burning barn and the bullet-riddled cabin and the wounded man on the ground. "Told you Larkin wouldn't be patient," Coulter said, pulling out a flask. "But I didn't reckon on this." He looked toward the creek bed. "Someone in town saw Kane and his boys ride out. Said they looked like they were heading for war. Figured I'd best come see for myself." Rhett took a long swallow from the flask, the whiskey burning a trail down his throat. He looked at June, who was tearing a strip from her dress to make a tourniquet. He looked at his children huddled together, safe. The barn was gone. His leg was shot. But they were alive. They were together. In that moment, that was the only victory that mattered. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But they had survived the battle. Now they had to find a way to win the war. The aftermath of the siege was a landscape of quiet devastation. The barn smoldered for 2 days, a black skeletal ruin against the bruised evening sky. The cabin, though standing, bore the scars of the battle-splintered wood, shattered window panes, and the dark, pockmarked holes where bullets had found their mark. But inside life, tenacious and fragile, was knitting itself back together. June proved to be as skilled a nurse as she was a farmhand. She cleaned and dressed Rhett's wound with a steady hand, her touch gentle but firm. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his thigh, missing the bone. It was a painful, debilitating injury, but with rest he would walk again. For now, he was confined to his cot by the hearth, a frustrated and unwilling patient. He watched as June withdrew as her silent, capable second-in-command took charge. They organized the children, assessed the damage, and began the slow, arduous process of putting their world back together. They salvaged what they could from the barn's wreckage, a few scorched tools, a blackened anvil. They mucked out the stalls where the 2 horses, thankfully set free during the fire, had been housed. Life went on, dictated by the rhythm of necessity. Sheriff Coulter had taken Kane and his men back to Redemption Creek, locking them in his jailhouse. But both Rhett and the sheriff knew that was a temporary solution. The warrants Kane carried, though, obtained under false pretenses, were signed by a circuit judge. Larkin would not let his hired guns rot in a small-town jail. He would use the full weight of his authority to get them released and to escalate his campaign against Rhett. "He's overplayed his hand," Coulter had said before leaving. "This wasn't law enforcement. It was a private war. He's given us an opening. But we have to move fast." The plan they concocted was audacious. Coulter would use the attack on the ranch as grounds to launch his own investigation into Judge Larkin's conduct, citing abuse of power and the use of unlawful force. He would send a rider to the territorial capital with a formal complaint, but that would take weeks. In the meantime, Larkin was still the highest legal authority in the region, and he would not sit idle. The true battle would have to be fought, not with guns, but with the truth. Rhett knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that the key to everything, the Lockett Larkin's obsessive hatred, June's persecution, was buried in his own past. He had to finally confront the ghosts of that duel. 2 days after the attack, as June was changing the dressing on his leg, he finally spoke of it. "Alistair Larkin's brother." His name was Thomas Rhett, began his voice low and raspy. "We were partners once. Bought a stretch of land together down by the San Pedro. We were going to raise cattle. But Thomas, He had a thirst for risk. He started making deals behind my back, mortgaging our land to fund gambles on silver mines that never panned out. When I found out, I confronted him. He pulled a gun on me, said the land was his. June listened, her hands still her full attention on him. I tried to walk away. Rhett continued, his eyes distant, lost in the memory. But he called me a coward. He challenged me to a duel. It was foolish, a matter of pride. I shouldn't have accepted. But I did. Sarah, my wife, she begged me not to go. But I wouldn't listen. He paused, the pain of the memory twisting his face. We met at dawn. His brother Alistair was his second. We fired. My shot hit him in the chest. At the same moment, Sarah ran out from behind the trees, trying to stop us. The bullet that killed him, it passed through and hit her. She died in my arms. The official report called it a duel, but Alistair saw it as murder. He watched me kill his brother, and in his eyes, his brother's bullet killed my wife. He's been nursing that hatred ever since. He looked at June, his eyes filled with a guilt that had haunted him for years. He's not after you, June. He never was. You were just a tool, a way to get to me, to take away the new family I was building, just like he believes I took his. Suddenly, it all made a terrifying kind of sense. The desecration of Sarah's grave to retrieve the locket, an act of psychological torture. The relentless legal assault. The violent attack on the ranch. It was all part of a cold, calculated revenge plot. As the weight of the revelation settled over the room, a new resolve hardened June's expression. Then he doesn't know us, she said, her voice quiet but fierce. He thinks he can break you by taking me. But he's wrong. We're not just pieces he can move around on a board. Just then, Jude burst into the cabin, his face pale. Rider coming. It's a deputy from town. The deputy brought the news they had been dreading. Judge Larkin, citing jurisdictional authority, had arrived in Redemption Creek and ordered the release of S. Everett Kane. Not only that he had issued a new, more powerful warrant, it named June as a material witness in the unlawful assault on Kane and his men, and ordered her immediate transfer to the county seat for protection and testimony. It was a legal kidnapping. But the deputy, a young man with a conscience, had also brought a whispered message from Sheriff Coulter. The sheriff says Larkin is moving fast. He's taking the girl himself. He's meeting Kane and his men at the old mission church east of here near the Badlands. He wants to be well clear of Coulter's jurisdiction before anyone can stop him. He pressed a folded piece of paper into Jude's hand. It was a hastily drawn map. Larkin had made his final move. He was taking June, and he was doing it himself, away from prying eyes. Rhett looked at his wounded leg, a fresh wave of fury and helplessness washing over him. He couldn't ride. He couldn't fight. I'll go, Jude said, his voice cracking but firm. He held up the pistol. No, Rhett said, his voice iron. You will not. He looked at June, his heart aching. He had brought this danger to her doorstep, and now he was powerless to protect her. June knelt beside his cot, her eyes meeting his. There was no fear in them now, only a calm, unwavering strength. You've fought for me, she said softly. Now it's my turn to fight for us. She stood up. I'll go with him. I will face him. June, no, Rhett protested, trying to sit up the pain in his leg, white hot. He'll kill you. No, he won't. She said, a strange certainty in her voice. Killing me doesn't serve his purpose. His revenge is about destroying you. He needs me alive for that. But he's made a mistake. He thinks I'm still the scared, broken girl who ran from her stepmother. He doesn't know who I am now. Before Rhett could argue further, she turned to the deputy. Tell Judge Larkin I will meet him, but not on his terms. Tell him to come alone. One man to escort one girl. If I see Kane or any of his men, I will not come out. It was an incredible bluff, a gamble played with the only cards she had. But it might just work. It would appeal to Larkin's arrogance, his belief in his own untouchable authority. The deputy, stunned, could only nod. He rode off, leaving a tense, uncertain silence in his wake. Rhett stared at June, a mixture of terror and awe on his face. "What are you planning?" She picked up the silver locket from the table, its surface gleaming in the firelight. "He thinks this is a story about his revenge," she said, her fingers closing around it. "I'm going to make it a story about the truth." The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, a swirling mass of gray and purple clouds pressing down on the land. A sandstorm was brewing on the horizon, the wind carrying the first gritty taste of dust. The abandoned mission church stood on a lonely mesa, a crumbling adobe skeleton against the angry sky. Its bell tower was silent, its windows dark and empty eyes staring out at the desolate Badlands. Judge Alistair Larkin waited inside the wind, whistling through the cracks in the walls, creating a mournful, eerie hymn. He paced the dusty aisle, his polished boots leaving tracks between the decaying pews. He had agreed to the girl's terms. It was a foolish theatrical demand, but it suited him. It would be cleaner this way. He would take her, break her spirit, and then use her testimony to utterly ruin Rhett Mallory. He would see him stripped of his land, his children, his very name, before leaving him to rot in a territorial prison. The symmetry of it was poetic. He heard the slow, steady hoofbeats of a single horse. He moved to the doorway and saw her. June was riding toward the church alone, her small figure resolute against the vast, threatening landscape. She dismounted, her movements calm and deliberate, and tied her horse to a skeletal mesquite tree. She walked toward the church, her eyes never leaving Larkin's. As she stepped into the dim, dust-filled interior, the first grains of the storm began to whip through the air. "You came?" Larkin said, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Foolish, but brave, I'll grant you that." "I came to finish this, June," said her voice not trembling. She stopped in the center of the aisle, a safe distance from him. "This was never about me, was it? It's about him. About your brother." Larkin's mask of judicial calm cracked. A flicker of raw hatred showed in his eyes. "You know nothing. I know he was your brother," June said, her voice ringing with clarity. "And I know Rhett Mallory has carried the guilt of his death and his wife's every single day since it happened." "What have you carried, Judge?" "Besides this bitter, poisonous grudge, he took everything from me." Larkin snarled, his composure finally shattering. "My brother, my family's honor. He shot him down in cold blood and built this new happy life on his grave." "He didn't build a life on a grave," June countered, her voice rising with passion. "He built it from the ashes of his own. He gave a home to 3 grieving children and to a girl who had nothing. That's not an insult to your brother's memory, that's redemption." As they spoke, shadows detached themselves from the deeper darkness at the back of the church. Everett Kane and 2 of his men stepped out from behind the crumbling altar, their guns drawn. June's eyes widened, but she didn't scream. She had expected a trap. "The girl has a point," Judge Kane said, his voice a low drawl. He wasn't looking at June, he was looking at Larkin. "All this talk of honor and revenge, it's not very profitable." Larkin spun around his face, a mask of fury and betrayal. "Kane, what is the meaning of this?" "The meaning," Kane said with a cold smile, "is that my services now come at a higher price. The girl is leverage, not just against Mallory, but against you. A circuit judge conspiring in a kidnapping. That's a story worth a great deal of money. Enough to ensure my silence." The sandstorm hit the church with full force. The wind shrieked and sheets of sand blasted against the walls, pouring through the broken windows. The light inside dimmed to a murky, swirling twilight. It was in that moment of chaos that the church's heavy oak doors burst open. Rhett Mallory stood there, silhouetted against the storm. He wasn't supposed to be there. He was wounded, helpless. But he was there. He leaned heavily on a makeshift crutch, but in his right hand he held his Colt steady and aimed. Behind him stood Jude, holding a rifle with a resolve that made him look twice his age. "Get away from her," Rhett's voice boomed over the wind, a sound of pure, righteous fury. Larkin stared dumbfounded. Kane recovered first. "Kill them," he yelled to his men. The church erupted into a maelstrom of noise and violence. Jude fired the rifle, the shot going wide in the swirling dust, but forcing one of Kane's men to duck. Rhett, bracing himself against the doorframe, fired his Colt. His shot was true, and the second thug crumpled to the floor. Kane spun, firing at Rhett, but his shot was spoiled by the wind and the poor light. June, seizing her chance, grabbed a heavy wooden collection plate from a nearby pew and threw it with all her might at Kane's head. It struck him with a dull thud, making him stumble. Larkin, his face a contortion of mad rage, pulled a small derringer from his coat and aimed it at June. "If I can't destroy him," he screamed over the storm, "I will take what he loves." Before he could fire, Rhett lunged forward, ignoring the searing pain in his leg. He crashed into Larkin, sending them both tumbling to the floor. The derringer flew from Larkin's hand, skittering into the shadows. Rhett, using the last of his strength, brought the barrel of his Colt down on Larkin's head, knocking him unconscious. Meanwhile, Kane had recovered, his face murderous. He raised his pistol to shoot June, but Jude, having reloaded, fired the rifle again. The shot hit Kane in the shoulder, spinning him around. He staggered back, clutching his arm, his eyes wide with shock and pain. He looked from Jude's unwavering gaze to Rhett, who was now pushing himself to his feet. He was outmatched, defeated. He dropped his gun and fled out a side door, disappearing into the blinding storm. Silence fell, broken only by the howling of the wind. Rhett limped toward June, his face etched with pain and relief. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. Jude ran to them, and the three of them stood together in the eye of the storm, a broken but unbeaten family. As the sandstorm began to subside, a new sound reached them, the jingle of harnesses and the shouts of men. Sheriff Coulter and his deputies, guided by a hunch and the deputy's map, surrounded the church. They found Larkin slumped on the floor and the dead gunman in the corner. The story piece by painful piece came out. Back at the ranch, as the first rays of dawn broke through the dust-choked sky, a quiet sense of finality settled over them. The war was over. Larkin was in custody, his career and his vendetta in ruins. Kane was a fugitive, wounded and alone in the Badlands. Rhett sat on the porch, his bandaged leg propped up on a stool. June sat beside him, cleaning the rifle with methodical care. The children were asleep inside, safe in their beds. After a long, comfortable silence, Rhett reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver locket. He opened it and looked at Sarah's face. For the first time, the memory didn't bring a sharp stab of guilt, but a gentle, bittersweet ache. "I need to tell you everything," he said softly. He told June the whole truth of the duel, sparing no detail of his own pride and foolishness. He spoke of his suffocating guilt, the burden he had carried alone for 4 long years. He unburdened his soul, and June listened, her presence a silent, unwavering source of strength and grace. When he was finished, he looked not at the locket, but at her. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" she asked. "For helping me find my way back." A few months later, on a clear, sun-drenched morning, Rhett, June, and the children rode out to a small, windswept hill that overlooked the ranch. Under a lone, gnarled oak tree was a simple wooden cross marking Sarah's grave. The children laid wildflowers at its base. Rhett walked to the headstone, the silver locket in his hand. He looked at it one last time, a final, silent goodbye to the woman he had loved and the man he had been. Then, with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years, he gently placed the locket on the wooden cross. It was not an act of forgetting, but of honoring. A gesture that acknowledged the past without being imprisoned by it. He turned and took June's hand, and their fingers lacing together. Miriam, Jude, and Cal gathered around them. They stood there for a long moment, a family forged in the crucible of violence and grief, looking out at their home, their future stretching before them like the vast open land. The open door had become a home. The sanctuary had become a fortress of love. And the man who thought his life was over had found a new beginning.